Hi, hello, welcome. It's Unkempt Snugglepepper for another episode of Art Critiques from Reddit. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment. Down in the doobly-doo, you will find my Buy Me a Coffee, as well as a link if you want to submit your own artwork. Today we have Purple Warrior. I added more at the bottom because I don't think the legs are quite long enough. But overall, there are three things that I want to talk about today, and that is the overall composition, the anatomy, and the shading. So let's start with the overall composition. So we have a person standing here. They have a sword which may be glowing, and they have magic which is definitely glowing. But the piece is predominantly this bright purple or electric pink sort of color. So when we have a background that is very saturated, we are taking away from the main character and the light source because the background matches the saturation and the intensity of the character. Another way we can look at bringing focus to something is through lighting. And I would make the main focus right here and put a central bit of light going throughout her clothing suggests that this is a bigger light source. However, if it's a light source and it's casting that much light, then there's going to be a difference in value. So what I did here is I took the fill bucket tool, I filled the image with black and then set the type of layer to saturation. That removes all color. So we are now looking at a black and white piece. And we can see that our light source is not the brightest part of the piece. Her crotches, her white in her uniform, part of her boot, her hair, they are all begging for attention when really the brightest point of the piece should be over here in the lightning. Another issue with composition is that these trees are very detailed, but then she lacks that level of detail. So the focus is no longer on her, it's on some of these trees, which I would put one more dark one right here before it fades off into the distance. My guess is used a photograph or some sort of background and color changed it and then created the background that way, or with brushes, since the shading style doesn't match the shading style of the character. My next guess to why that might be the case is because the light is coming from this direction, but we don't show that at all on the character. So those are some notes on composition. I'm going to bring the opacity down and we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy and how she's standing. So we have her head. We're doing pretty okay on head size. Her lips are going to be a little higher, her nose a little higher, and then her eyes even about there. We have a neck, and then our chest is turned this way. And we have our breast. There's our rib cage. Unless she's very muscular, I would bring her waist in just a little bit. And then here we have her hip bones. Here would be one hip. Here's the other hip. And they should follow the curve of her chest. She's not going to be standing straight forward with her hips and her chest turned this way. Then this arm can stay over here and be holding all of that magic. Something that I didn't realize, swords are really heavy. And so to have all of this armor and a sword, her elbow is going to come in a little bit. And so I would either have the sword be lower and going across the body like so, which also leads the eye to the magic. She could have just drawn the sword. Generally, it's not going to go straight across the body unless you're holding it forward. So her hand would be up here. and her elbow's at a bend, and we're seeing some foreshortening. Then her sword's going to be straight across. Note that it would be a little difficult to fight with both magic and a sword, or do it two-handed and then holding the sword like so. It is very difficult to fight with both hands. At least it's difficult to fight with two swords because you're watching what the other person is doing as well. Magic seems more long range, where a sword would be more short range. You have to be pretty close to do anything with the sword. So you might consider keeping it sheathed, because we would still see it hanging out here. So the hips hang out here. I think your intent was to have her legs slightly bent. Interesting story. At one point in time, I worked on a lock psych unit, and we had to be trained in how to do holds. And one of the things is to square your pelvis to make sure that you have a little bit of bend in your knee and that your feet are no more than shoulder width apart. Because putting them this far apart, you're not helping your balance any. So I'm putting my knee about there. And then this foot is turned out. And yeah, they would be a little bit longer. So this foot is turned out so that it's facing us, while this leg is going to be behind her. More like that. How do I know this, and how can you get better at anatomy? I recommend doing some anatomical studies, so more figure drawing. Pose Maniacs is a great resource. More practice is going to give you a better understanding of how different parts of the body work in certain situations, so that when you're drawing something that's in your head, you have more of a reference for it. For future pieces, I would compile a mood board and kind of think, this is what I want the pose to look like. This is what I want the clothing to look like. All sorts of things along those lines. So let's talk about the shading. There are three types of edges. One is a hard edge, which is what we see in cubes. That we have a dark side and we have a light side. Right? This is a hard edge. It's saying that there is a plane change from this side, and now this plane is facing a completely different direction. An example of a hard edge that should be in your piece is going to be this part of her armor. This part of her armor. So if our light source is over here, and that's where we want our brightest color to be, this is our brightest light source, and it's reflecting off this way, so this side should be our lightest. Right in here, so this color goes right there. And since it is a square, and that's the brighter side, then this side is getting less light. And this crevice is getting even less light. And then the sides like that. So that's how I would do a hard edge. And if she's holding something this bright, this close to her, she's also going to have hard edges on the face as well. The next kind of edge is going to be what we find in circles and cylinders, and that is going to be a soft edge. So there's our circle, and to make it a sphere, we're going to move progressively lighter. And it has a little bit of reflective light. So that is our soft edge. There are so many little edges that we aren't seeing. We're seeing a soft edge go from here through here. So how does a soft edge apply? And you might say, hey, I did plenty of soft edges. However, there's not simply soft edges. There are soft edges and hard edges. So for example, her boot, this is a cylinder. So here we have where our shadow would be. There's going to be a little bit of light coming from the outside that's going to help separate her from the background. And if there really is light coming in this direction, like on the trees, then there's going to be a soft, natural, yellowish light coming in here to reflect. And then under the boot gets a bit of a shadow. That can be, it looks like these are supposed to be a little darker. So now we've created the sense that this is going around the leg. The light source is coming from this direction. And because it's a cylinder, we can give it a bit more of a soft edge to give it more of a three-dimensional look. However, be careful because a lot of this is overblended, meaning the edges are too soft. And I think that comes from a couple of reasons. One is you may be going for that soft airbrushed look, but too much of it makes a piece look very fuzzy. My other theory is you aren't exactly sure where to put the shadows or why to put a shadow. So every time the light touches something, every time it hits a plane, there's going to be highlight, and every time that item faces away from the shadow, every time an item faces away from the light or something blocks the light, that's going to create a shadow. For example, her belt's going to cast a shadow. It's blocking the light of her spell. She's also going to have a bit more definition in the crotch area. This leg is also going to have radial shading, so the highlight will be here. There'll be a bit of a shadow here as the leg turns away. And then as this leg, we have a little bit of difference because she's wearing a different color there. So that leg is going to also have the similar shading. And then we can reintroduce that white stripe, which shouldn't be as bright as this highlight because it's coming directly from there if this is that strong of a light source. Now, the third type of edge is a lost edge. And lost edges are kind of tricky because if you use too many of them, you're starting to get into abstract art. And if you use only soft edges, then you get a blurred look. So a lost edge is where two things are next to each other, and due to shadow, the value is so similar that it begins to disappear. So a place you could put the lost edge is if she's closer to the foliage, I would blur her out a little bit into the foliage. But in this piece, I don't think you're going to have too many lost edges. You may not have as much detail as you would like, but I don't think that's going to apply as much here. If you want more information on that, I highly recommend checking out Marco Bucci videos. All of them. The man is great. But he does talk about different edges and edge work, which is where most of this information comes from. So understanding overall that the body is made of geometric shapes, and those geometric shapes are going to act in a certain way under lighting conditions is going to help you determine where the shading goes. Another example is here. This is way lighter than over here. However, her left breast, make sure I got my directions, her left breast is going to be more in shadow. All of this is going to be in shadow. And then she's going to have a little bit of a highlight, because I assume this is going across her breast. She's going to have a little bit of a highlight. A little bit more shadow. A little bit of highlight, and then this breast is going to have the most amount of highlight. And since it is an even distance, it's also going to come around towards the bottom. Now, if her lightning is glowing and if her sword is glowing, they need to be represented with the brightest values. So the sword should have a white streak going through it, much like a lightsaber would. Overall, a few changes I would make would be the anatomy. And then if I were to make changes to the actual piece, I would lower the saturation first and foremost to about there. That's putting the saturation layer at 61%. A way to check saturation is in the color picker. So many things are competing. We have the lightning, which is hanging out here all the way saturated. We have her boots all the way saturated. We have this purple that's hanging out pretty close. It's more saturated than desaturated. Even her leather is hitting a really bright red where I would put it closer to over here in a grayish red. And then everything in the background is hitting an equal level of saturation. And so what happens is we don't know where to look. There's too much color. It's too bright. There's too much going on. So I would desaturate everything. And then I would refocus on where do I want my viewer's attention to go. I would start with the lightning and bring back that really hot pink. I would say there's so much lightning going on, we can't see her hand. And kind of start bringing that back in. And this hot pink. And it would help if I'm on a different layer. Right, so I'm bringing that hot pink back in, but I'm doing it very intentionally. This is pretty common in digital art. It's also common in traditional art. A lot of times people will go buy the 100 different color paint set because they don't want to mix colors. And what ends up happening is their paintings don't look cohesive because they have too many colors. Whereas if you're mixing from a limited palette, first, you're going to have a better understanding of color theory, and second, you're also going to have a more cohesive piece since all of your colors came from the same four colors. In digital art, I find it to be something similar, that we have access to every color you could imagine. And pixels are free, so it's not like I have to pay more if I want a magenta or a fuchsia. But that becomes very dangerous because then everything is taken to the max and we get too much saturation. Now, with this, I know there's a glow, so now I know what parts of her I would want highlighted in the side of her face. And the more you understand the geometry of things, including like the geometry of her face, the more you're going to be able to accurately provide shadows. The face was also very saturated. This is a more accurate representation of how skin tones are. In traditional art, usually when I make a flesh tone, I use some titanium white, cadmium red. I go back and forth between yellow ochre and cadmium yellow light, which gives me a very light orange. And then to cool it off, to tone it down a little bit, I add some ultramarine blue. So that's going to give us, my thought process here with the face is that since this light is so bright, it's going to create harsh shadows on the face rather than soft shadows. And that's something that I would look up under lighting, and I would look up Rembrandt lighting. So those are a few things that I would work on. So in review, overall composition wise, we have different ways to bring focus to things, and we want to use color, value, saturation, detail in order to enhance something that we want to look at, something that the artist wants the viewer to be drawn to right away. I recommend focusing on anatomy studies and doing pose studies. There are various websites out there. I'll try to link some that are good for practicing poses both Uh, I don't know your age, but if you're under 18, definitely do the clothed figure. I don't want any angry parents. I don't know the age of this person, but know that there are resources where figure study uh does mean just the figure. And then third is understanding edges. If you're going to use line work, I highly recommend doing cell shading. They tend to go well together. And if you use only hard edges, then it's cell shading, and that's you can learn a lot from using cell shading compared to painting where there's hard edges and soft edges. However, only using soft edges is going to give the overall appearance of being blurry. If you found this helpful, go ahead and give this a like. Leave me a comment with any questions or concerns you have. Say hello to my cat. Link down in the doobly-doo is a link to buy me a coffee, as well as the link if you would like to submit your artwork for me to critique. Have a good one.